So what we are going to be covering for you tonight is, first of all, we're going to be kicking off with some opportunities for a new Wildlife Act. What are the key things and key opportunities that we have to improve this review? And that's going to be covered by Phil Ingemels, staff member for VNPA. And then we have Bruce Lindsay from Environmental Justice Australia, and he is going to give you an eagle view of the legal, all things legal. And then we're going to be covering the key issues with the Act currently. That's going to be covered by Matt, who I know that you all have seen speak many times. And then I'm going to be covering a bit of the why and how to go about writing a submission and the importance of that. And then at the end, we're going to be taking some questions and answering your questions at the end, as many as we can get through. So first of all, I am going to hand it over to Phil Ingemels. He is works in parks protection for the VNPA, and Phil has been with the VNPA for around about 20 years now. So Phil has a plethora of knowledge and history of what it takes to really manage and look after the land which we are living on. And so, yeah, it's a great pleasure that I wanted to hand over to Phil to tell you a bit more about the opportunities that we have for this Wildlife Act at the moment. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Shannon. I just want to start. I mean, basically, the Wildlife Act, as we know it, it's a fairly old act, and it's full of all sorts of odds and sods and things. It doesn't have a very clear kind of reason to be there. Well, it has a number of reasons to be there, but not a very clear sort of overall thing. And I think we can take, rather than before we go into the detail, to actually look at what we can actually gain from this point of revision. And that basically, I think the first point that we should set out is to have a dedicated act which protects native wildlife, not just anything that happens to be out there in the wild. We already have a Threatened Species Act, the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, but that deals with threatened species. This is about how do we protect and care for the broad population of all of our wildlife species out there to ensure their longevity. That we have to protect the viability of populations to maintain healthy populations that can live and evolve and maintain their presence in the long term. It's the job of our generation really to do this. And in particular, to reverse long-term declines, not of threatened species, or we don't want to lose threatened species, but we have to address the long-term declines of even common species. And I think this is something that the detail in the Act should be consistent in addressing. So just to keep that in mind as an overall thing. The other one is to remove the anachronistic protections of non-native species. This includes the numbers of quails and pheasants and things like that, which have no great consequence. But most particularly, the Act has been protecting deer as a game species. And that's, given that deer are such an enormously damaging animal, that's one of the things that we clearly have to address. This is an Act that protects native wildlife. It shouldn't be an Act that protects non-native deer, particularly damaging one. An example of the silliness of it all is that sambar deer, which is probably our most destructive deer, is listed as a threatening process under Victoria's FFG Act. So that Threatened Species Act actually recognises the damage that deer are doing. Yet it is still currently protected as a game species under the Wildlife Act. And you shouldn't have laws in a country which compete with each other. It just doesn't really make sense. So we'll be dealing in much more detail with that later. Matt Rookle, our director, will be dealing with that. But I think it's just good to put that in as an overall outline of what we see as the purpose of the Act. So what I might do now is hand over to Dr. Bruce Lindsay from the Environmental Justice Australia, who really knows his way around Victorian environmental law. So I'd like to welcome Bruce, if I may. Thanks, Bruce.
So what I'd like to do is go through a few high-level or headline points that I see as central to what Phil has identified as the opportunity set out in the current review. It's worth noting that what is occurring here is a review of the Wildlife Act within reasonably broad terms of reference by an expert panel. So it's being done to some degree at arm's length from government, which is, in my view, always a healthy thing. That panel will then report, and the government will probably take quite a considerable amount of time to figure out what its response is going to be. So nothing's necessarily imminent, but it is quite an important and arguably once-in-a-generation opportunity. As Phil's indicated, the current law that we've got is effectively an accumulation of laws and amendments to laws that have kind of grown over time since about the 1920s, when we had what were called game laws, or game acts, which were really about who got to control wildlife and who got to shoot them and hunt them, and then various other things have been kind of patched on to the Act over time. The current Wildlife Act dates from 1975, and then it's been amended quite considerably since then as well. I'll leave to the questions the issue of what the current law really is, but what I'd like to highlight at the moment is, I guess, what I see as some of the headline areas or possibilities for change. At a very high level, I think there's two real things that are imperative in this entire exercise from a legal standpoint. First of all, there's the opportunity to make the Act effectively a contemporary and effective environmental law. So that's one important direction of change here, I think, and I'll come to what that might mean as an environmental law in a sec. The second is really the need to align the legal framework, the legislative framework, with contemporary standards of democratic and accountable public administration and legislative drafting. What I mean by that is that the law in its current form is quite archaic in terms of the mechanisms and the tools and the processes that it sets up. And for instance, there's a great deal of lack of transparency in what happens under the Act, as an example, and that's there's been broad changes in how laws work in terms of administrative processes and so forth over 40 years, and this Act is really well behind the times in that respect. So they're two, I think, really high-level headline issues. What I might do now is go through what I see. I've got 7 main points that I wanted to point you to in terms of directions for reform, and these are a summary, in effect, of pretty complex response that is possible to do here, and I don't think everyone needs to provide such a detailed response. A lot of your responses and submissions will come from your own interests and knowledge and experiences, so I'm kind of talking to some of the legal framing and legal tools. So first of all, I think there's the issue of what should be the objectives and principles that underpin the Act. And there is a fair amount of ambiguity in the Act at the moment, as Phil's indicated. The Act, so I'm getting responses that the audio is not very good, so I apologise. I'm not sure I can do a lot about that. In terms of objectives, the Act actually really has a number of objectives at the moment that are quite in tension or contradiction with each other. On the one hand, it purports some kind of conservation objectives, but at the same time, it's very much geared toward, in effect, killing animals. A lot of the actual practical application of the Act is about what we might call take and destruction of wildlife. So I think a first point of call is being very clear on what we want the law to do in its objectives and principles. And in my view, primarily what we should have here is a law whose primary objective is biodiversity conservation, or it should be primarily an environmental law. In our proposal, we're setting out what I'll call an overarching objective for the Act, which is effectively about the protection, conservation, recovery and restoration of wildlife. Within that, there's various other kind of subsidiary objects and also principles under the Act. I won't go into those unless people want me to. The other key thing that I think is very important if we're going to have what we might call a contemporary or best practice environmental law, is that the law takes an ecological approach or an ecosystem approach to what the whole legislative scheme is trying to do. That is to say, we're not simply trying to protect or to enable the harm of particular species, but we're doing that within the context of how ecosystems function and wildlife as intrinsic components of ecological systems. So that goes to the issue of the main, what should be the objectives and principles underpinning the Act. The second thing I want to deal with is what do we understand wildlife to be? As Phil's indicated, the concept of wildlife under the Act is actually quite controversial because it includes things that are non-native and indeed invasive species like deer. In other respects, what is considered wildlife under the Act are vertebrate species at the moment and invertebrate species where they're listed as threatened species. That come under the category of what's called protected wildlife. Where species are listed under the FFG Act, they're also known as threatened wildlife. We've retained those categories, but in addition, I think there's a couple of other categories of wildlife that we can discern for wildlife protection. One is wildlife that is culturally significant to Aboriginal people. And secondly, and this goes in many respects to the ecological approach, is that we can identify and protect what are known as keystone species, which are species that have a particularly important role to play in ecosystems. So that kind of both clarifies and attempts to widen the categories of what we understand wildlife to be, or the wildlife that is protected under the Act. The third thing I want to bring people's attention to...
Excuse me, Bruce.
Yeah.
Your audio is extremely crackly. We're having it sort of going loud bits and small, soft bits. Would you have an earpiece at all that you might be able to use?
No, I don't on the computer, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I apologise. I can't do much about that because if I'd done it on my phone, I could have. That might have been better. If it's particularly bad, I can drop out and do this on my phone. Would people prefer that I do it that way?
Someone suggested maybe you speak softer.
Okay, I'll try that. That's difficult for a lawyer, you know. So the third thing I wanted to make reference to is how the Wildlife Act interacts with other laws. There's probably three main other laws that are worth considering in how the Wildlife Act works and how it interacts with other laws. First of all, there's alignment with the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, which is the main Biodiversity Act and Threatened Species Act in Victoria. There are some alignments and interactions with that law now, but there's ways in which that can be improved, and there's a whole lot of tools under the FFG Act, like critical habitat protections, that can be used and mandated more widely under the Wildlife Act. Secondly, there's how the law aligns with the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is our main welfare act in Victoria. At the moment, anything done under the Wildlife Act is exempted from the application of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which is quite problematic in terms of basically, killing or harming native wildlife. The third area where there's potential for alignment is the Aboriginal Heritage Act, in my view, and in particular how we could get better interactions and alignment between what's called, or basically connections to country or Aboriginal intangible heritage, and also cultural rights that operate in Victoria, and Aboriginal interests and rights in relation to particular wildlife. The fourth point I wanted to refer to is how decision-making works under the Act. Now, at the moment, one of the main functions of the Act is really permitting or authorising the take and use or killing of wildlife. It's a very opaque process. There's really no laws around how that's... there's really no laws around how that is to be transparent, or how that's properly to operate. So there's a few things that we can build in there. First of all, kind of standard provisions around providing notice and applications to take wildlife, having proper assessment processes that are subject to public scrutiny and accountability, that decisions are made on the basis of best available science, that there are programs to support citizen science and community-based monitoring of wildlife, and also that there's performance auditing mechanisms for that whole permitting process. So there's a whole lot of kind of standard best practice mechanisms around public administration that could be quite readily and easily adopted into the Wildlife Act. An example of this, for instance, is having merits review of decisions to permit the take of wildlife, which is currently not available. So currently, people who apply to kill wildlife under the Act, if they're knocked back, they can seek review at VCAT on that decision, but if it's granted, no one else can step in and seek review at VCAT of that decision in defence of the animals, for instance. The fifth point, and this is I've got 7, so the fifth main point that I'd mention is there's the issue of what is the nature of the state or the Crown's ultimate authority over wildlife. So what is the role of government ultimately in the management and authority over wildlife? What we've proposed here is that there is clarification around the nature of the Crown and public authorities' authority in relation to manage wildlife, and that authority should be accompanied by duties that are akin to a public trust, which is really about saying that if the Crown or the state has ultimate authority, decision-making authority over the fate of native wildlife, at the same time they have duties or obligations to ensure that wildlife is managed in accordance with the objectives of the Act, which are really objectives to protect and conserve and achieve the restoration of wildlife. So that goes to broadly, that's a version of what we often refer to as the public trust doctrine. The sixth point that I will make is about the issue of the regulator over the management of wildlife. Now, presently, the Act contains no independent regulator in terms of the management of wildlife, so either in relation to decision-making or planning or assessment or authorities to control wildlife. There is now a body within DELP called the Office of the Conservation Regulator, whose job it is effectively to take on that role of regulator. I've got some views on them, but I won't share them right now unless people want me to. What I do suggest that is needed is that we need effectively an independent statutory regulator or statutory authority for the governance and management of wildlife in Victoria, and that would have broad functions and powers. It might well be called something like a biodiversity commission, or it could be, it could even be wider and be an environmental commission or something like that. That body should properly be, in my view, responsible for things like policy settings, but also decision-making, assessment and planning under the Act, and also compliance and enforcement under the Act. And the final point that I want to make, the seventh point I want to make, concerns compliance and enforcement. So presently, compliance and enforcement under the Act is at best very rare, if not non-existent. In fact, the enforcement of the wildlife is a classic case of a complete failure in the environmental rule of law, insofar as it's virtually never enforced. And the few times it has been enforced, it's just thrown up more problems and more questions and answers. Compliance and enforcement needs broad-scale reform, in my view, and major reform. Presently, there are certain criminal offences under the Act for taking wildlife and so forth. These need to be widened to include a broader range of things like civil sanctions and civil penalties, enforcement orders, a whole lot of other legal tools that are typically available under modern environmental laws. Those broad range of sanctions should be guided by principles of ecological sustainability, and in particular, I would suggest that those sanctions are sufficient to what the courts have previously called or enabled a change in economic calculus of people who want to act illegally or illegally kill wildlife. Now, what that really means is either a combination of upping penalties quite substantially or changing the way in which enforcement works and penalties and offences work that simply make it the risk too high on those who want to act illegally. And finally, and particularly importantly, in our view, there's need for what we call third-party standing to enforce the Act, especially what we'd call open standing, which is effectively rules that would allow any person or any organisation to enforce the Act or to apply to a court to have the court intervene where there's alleged contraventions of the Act of any sort. So what that really means is that where there is some kind of breach of the Act, whether it's a criminal breach or some other kind of breach of the Act, so not all breaches of laws are criminal in nature, then, for instance, an NGO or a welfare organisation or an organisation like ours can step in and seek to have the law enforced in a court or in a tribunal or whatever the appropriate jurisdiction is. That is one of the key mechanisms that actually enables environmental laws or public interest laws typically to have traction. So many of you might know that my colleagues have recently, for instance, sought enforcement of illegal forest clearing in Victoria, one of the many things we've done. Those actions, enforcement actions, were actually taken by community groups, non-governmental organisations where we acted on their behalf, and were necessary over a number of years because the state itself patently failed to enforce the law. So that's all the points I wanted to make. I'm happy to take questions when we're done, but sort of that's the broad framing, I think, of how we want to see the Act changed. The slide that we've got up there is actually a bit of a mapping exercise in terms of how the Wildlife Act works or operates in relation to a whole broad range of other laws. So like many environmental laws, this one is, the whole system is quite fragmented, and really what we're trying to do in some respect is establish a situation where the protection of wildlife is both more coherent in itself, but also more effectively and coherently sits alongside and works with some other key laws, like, as I mentioned, like the FFG Act and welfare laws. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Shannon.
So now just handing over to Matt Ruckle, Executive Director of the VNPA, also has been around for a while and knows his stuff, so he's going to talk to you about some of the key issues with the Wildlife Act. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Shannon. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to see you all on a Tuesday night. So I'm going to make it fairly straightforward, I think, and we're still sort of working through a detailed submission, and as Bruce sort of highlights, some of those are quite complex. But I think for individual submissions that we're trying to encourage people to write, we try and keep it sort of relatively straightforward. So we've come up with a shorter list, which we're calling key issues. So one of them's about the first one, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of these and give you some more information, is about protecting the diversity of wildlife species. And as Phil mentioned, really making the Act, and as Bruce mentioned, ecologically focused. So it's about native wildlife, not about other things, and really getting that focus onto our native things. Certainly want to get rid of the deer and other native wildlife from the Act, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. Bruce mentioned the innocuous authority to control wildlife. permitting system, and we certainly need some stronger oversight for that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the other 4 points, I think, relate in the sense that at the moment you've got a fairly ad hoc system, or from at least from the outside, and I can't see any evidence from the inside that it's a cohesive or modern way of managing wildlife. So there should be an obligation also, if you're issuing permits to kill things, you have an obligation to monitor that population as well as the implementation of the permitting system. We talked about that in one of our emails. The authority to control wildlife is a shoot or shoo question, but it's not clear which ones are shooing and which ones are shooting. And often they're a lethal control option. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other one, which is a really key one, is sending a sort of modern message, if you like, about penalties for harming wildlife. One of the motivations the government got was the horrendous examples over the last year or so, where we had hundreds of wedge-tailed eagles killed in Gippsland. There was another case in central Victoria. There was the koala incident in a plantation in the southwest Victoria, which I think really triggered a lot of questions about why and how this act worked. The wedge-tailed eagles case, look, one of the prosecutions, the person received 14 days in jail with about $2,500 in fines, which is about $6 per wedge-tailed eagle. One of the other people got a 12-month community correction order with 100 hours of unpaid work and a $25,000 fine, which are not up to community standards, I think, for such large-scale killing of wildlife. And we know in other places that even criminal penalties and stricter interpretation about what the penalties are doing does lead to avoidance, particularly from larger operators. We also think that this is probably a simpler one, but there's no real clear consultation mechanism where there's expert advice fed into the Wildlife Act. So this goes a bit similar to the obligation to monitor wildlife. If you're issuing all these permits to kill things, you do need something a bit like what happens with threatened species. They've got an expert committee. They'd probably be slightly different people, but there should be an opportunity for that expert advice and a process for reviewing, oversighting, assisting with the implementation of the Act. And we fully agree with Bruce, many of Bruce's points, independent regulator that's separate, clearly defined, enforcing the law in a transparent and independent way is desperately needed. Not just for the Wildlife Act, but for other areas of environmental law in the state. I like to joke, and with greatest respect to the Italians, environmental law is a bit like Italian road rules. They're sort of guidelines, and you go with the vibe of the thing, and there's very poor enforcement and or compliance with many environmental laws. If you could flick on, Shannon, thanks. Move us on. So deer, just to talk a bit more about them and why we think this is a critical thing that everybody should put a submission in about to highlight. So deer, they damage almost every terrestrial Victorian habitat. We haven't seen a marine deer yet, but you never know. They also damage wetlands, crops, property. They have huge management costs. They destroy revegetation projects. They wreck water catchments, create sedimentation. They're causing lots of road accidents. We even had one bust into a funeral parlour a couple of years ago and caused $100,000 damage. We had one in one of the streets, probably going to the Cafe Latte in Fitzroy a few weeks ago. And we've had similar where someone hit one in Kew. So they're pushing into the city as well. the spin-off is also that there's a huge number of people wanting to hunt them, and there's issues with that, and we get sort of feedback from landowners all over the state where they're worried about the deer, but they're also worried about the rogue hunters who chase them as well. So Shannon, if you move on. Thank you. So just a quick map. There's over 1 million deer in Victoria estimated. This is a map of the 4 different types: the red deer, hog deer, fallow deer, sambar deer. The sambar deer is the size of a small cow, a reasonably sized cow. The hog deer is the size of a pig, I suppose, hence it's the hog deer. And fallow and red deer are smaller, but still do a lot of damage. They're more out in the west. And they're widespread, particularly in forested landscapes. So with about 1 million deer, government's accepted that sort of figure. Amateur hunters get 70 or so thousand a year, but a deer can have 2 to 3. I don't know what they're called, baby deer, but they can breed, and the population grows by 200,000 or 300,000 per year. So you've got sort of population dynamics taking over. The fact that their population has got to the point it is one of the drivers was they were introduced as a game species, and they've had the protection of the Wildlife Act ever since. Some of those things have been wound back slowly, but we need to get rid of it so there's a clear message that deer are a feral species. You could flick through, Shannon, so you can see one here. It's in the Alpine National Park. They love to wallow, do all that damage. Next one, thanks. This one's eating a threatened exposed patch community. This was caught on a sort of monitoring camera, having a good munch on a threatened community. And here's one in the front yard at Eltham. And we're getting more and more reports of these working into the urban area. So it needs to be a whole lot of stuff thrown at it. So we've made a little bit of progress on that. If you can flick to the next one. It took a while. So 2017, 18, there was a draft deer strategy put out. It was very poor, still wanting to protect them as a sort of hunting experience. Lots of groups signed on with scientists and agricultural groups in 2019. Local governments have also been involved. We got a final deer strategy released in 2020. While there's some money attached to it, not a great deal, but about $18 million, and it's going to develop 3 regional strategies. It didn't propose to remove the protected species or the protected game species status under the Wildlife Act. So it's still there, it's still an issue. The strategy's backing it up. We've had a Senate inquiry very recently unanimously call for all deer across Australia to be unprotected because there's an infestation in Victoria. It's also spreading into other jurisdictions, and Victoria's, I think Tasmania are the last mainland jurisdictions still to protect it. Obviously, the hunting lobby are keen to ensure that it is retained, but it's simply a weird system. The other key issue, I suppose, which I wanted to highlight, was the authority controlled wildlife permit system. So this is a very murky thing. It's essentially, well, in theory, it's a shoot off shoe, but mostly it's a shoot system. So it's a permitting system for control of wildlife. If we flick through to the couple of case studies in the next slide, you know, in the last 10 years, they've had 100 different animals, wombats, which were targeted for a tourism enterprise based on a historical exemption, emus, Australian fur seals, satin bowerbirds and black swans. It's unclear whether they're lethal or non-lethal, but in certain circumstances, certainly wombats were lethal. And it's very unclear, the lethal or non-lethal thing, because you can do a lot of things like netting for trees. You don't need a permit for that. You don't always need a permit for a bird scarer. So a lot of the permit triggers are probably lethal. We've also had permits for the control of threatened species like brolgas, turtles, magpie goose, which is just strange, inappropriate. So this is an important area, and I think Bruce touched on it. And so I just want to reinforce that you want a clear criteria for about how these permits are given out, and why, and how that's assessed. You want clear accountability for who's put the permits or approved them. You want it to be transparent so you can see it in the public. Why is this one being leased? How many? What they for? What was the detail of them? And you want some monitoring of the populations that are impacted by this to ensure that you're not doing excessive damage to particular to particular species populations inadvertently without understanding the consequences of what you're doing. So that needs to be strengthened dramatically. All right, that's a couple of ones you can get your teeth into. I'll hand over to Shannon to get stuck into writing your submission. So then there's other issues, of course. So there's a heap of other issues, but we just thought we'd focus on those couple for the minute.
Obviously we've heard some examples and a little bit of knowledge and experience from these guys about their experience with issues with the Wildlife Act. But no doubt you all have your own experience, wisdom, and knowledge that you might want to put in your own submission as well. So now we're just going to cover a bit about why and how to go about writing the submission. So let's get stuck in. So first of all, just to cover the why. So I think, it's probably pretty clear from some of the issues that we've covered tonight, but if you need some more incentive to write your submission, here's another 3 key points. So the first one is it's actually just a really important opportunity to express your own concerns and from your own experience and some of what you've heard here tonight as well about the need for a new Wildlife Act. It is the process for how to go about getting your inputs and your opinions, in this formal way. It's a chance to also learn yourself too about more of the issues that are facing our natural heritage, our wildlife, and how you can positively impact those. And you've got to be in it to win it, really. So, if you've got some issues and concerns, it's definitely important to make those heard, because the more that we do that, the more we have a chance of making a difference. And thirdly is that when many of us speak up and put our words down on paper and send it into these processes, it's just a chance to really communicate our collective community concerns at a greater level. And so I just wanted to use a quick example of the campaign to protect Western Port Bay, which VNPA worked with many local community groups and other statewide and national organisations to stop AGL's gas import terminal being built. Hurrah! The key thing I wanted to mention there was throughout the process of collecting public submissions into AGL's environmental assessment process, actually I think it was the largest amount of submissions ever submitted through an environmental assessment process. And really that just shows that, when people really, put forward and band together and put their views in, change can really happen. And that, it doesn't always have to be that the most submissions wins or anything like that. It's not all about quantity, it's all about quantity. Sorry, it's not all about quantity, it's also about quality as well. That that's sort of the fact that so many people put in submissions was actually used throughout the campaign and used in media and things like that. So just reiterating how important it is to actually make your concerns and opinions known. So let's go on to the how now. So how to structure your submission, and what we're actually going to focus on is that there are a few different ways that everyone can make your submission. But what I'm going to focus on just in this slide here is actually how to structure your submission. And sometimes the word submission can be a little scary, but if you don't like that word, feel free to replace it with letter or even just a couple of paragraphs as well. And the next slide, I'm actually going to go on to how to actually go about submitting that submission. So this slide is just about how to go about putting it together. And so even if it's a couple of paragraphs. So first of all, it's really important to introduce yourself. explain a little bit about who you are and about, sort of why you care is really important for the panel when they're reading this submission to know. So, definitely put in what part of Victoria you are living in as well, and about your experiences there too. Some of you may have connections to local friends groups or any, group that you are a member of. And if you think it's good, to mention that, definitely do, because it is really good to establish your credentials with the panel as well, and include your relevant experiences and qualifications in that as well. So second, point 2 is then to talk about, once you've introduced yourself and your relevant connections, is to discuss your views on how these wildlife laws are currently working, what are some good things about it, or how they're not working, what really needs to be reviewed and reformed here. And so this is really about identifying the issues that are important to you. So maybe they're some of what you've already heard tonight. You might just want to focus on 1 or 2, or you might want to cover a couple of them. It's really totally up to you. I wanted to mention here that if you don't have a lot of time to put your submission together, VNPA has put together a couple of key points, and Bruce has outlined his as well from the legal perspective. All it takes is just to, briefly mention a couple of those as well. But for those of you who have a bit more time and you want to read the issues paper, which the government have released, which talks about the details and some of their questions that they're looking to be answered in a bit more detail, that is an option for you too. And don't worry, we're going to be providing all the links where you can go to find all of these links and documents as well. So really, when you're talking about the issue that you care about and you want to discuss, describe if it's, an issue locally or at a statewide level, and make sure you include your own perspectives and experiences with that as well. And this leads us on to number 3. It's always good to use evidence or science, data, facts, figures to back up a lot of your claims and opinions where you can. So, but if you can't, that's okay too. It's definitely better to put them in rather than miss them out, because you never know, the panel, as they're reading through everyone's submissions, it could just be your dot point that they actually pick up and take and actually put in their final recommendations to the government. Okay, and so once you've gone through the stage of putting together your submission, your letter, your couple of key paragraphs, then you actually want to go onto the Engage Victoria website, which is where you can upload your submission. And this is also where you might find some more information about how to submit a more thorough submission to, and read a lot of the documents that the government this panel have put together as well. So this page here is a small section of the page that we will provide you links to, where you go to submit your submission. And so you'll notice here on the bottom there are 3 boxes. The left one is general comments, the middle one is issues paper questions, and then the third one on the right is submission uploads. So just see where that arrow is pointing. We are recommending that everyone go to this submission upload box here and click that, because that is just the simplest and straightforward way for you to upload your submission. And the screen looks like this. So submission uploads, all you have to do is pop in your personal details and then upload your Word, actually it says there a PDF document. So yeah, so it is sort of quite basic once you sort of get to that step. So the submission deadline has been extended to the 30th of June. So we have got a little extra time. So definitely enough time to start our submissions and, put in some detail if we do have the time to do that. So yeah, just to make it clear, VNPA will be putting in our own submission. So this is for your own personal submission. So hopefully we've provided a bit of information which empowers you to be able to do that. It doesn't matter how detailed or how simple it is. If you've got something to say, it's definitely better to get that in. And I think it all makes us feel empowered too, that we're actually taking actions and making a difference that way if we actually put something in. So just to cover off the next steps as well, in case you were wondering. So really where we're at right now is the first and really important opportunity for you to have your say in terms of how we can better protect our wildlife. And so at the moment, submissions are open until the 30th of June. And submissions, this is when submissions need to be in by. And so the panel, who is this independent panel who is, independently reviewing and providing all of their recommendations and this information to government, are in the process of meeting with stakeholders and reading your submissions when you put them in through. And VNPA has already met with the panel to discuss some of our issues with them directly as well. So post that, so once submissions close, the panel reads all the submissions and gathers all the information from all their meetings that they've had with their stakeholders, and they prepare a report, and then they present that to the minister by the end of August this year. So it is a relatively quick deadline. So that's why it's really important to get our collective thoughts and opinions in at the moment. And then thirdly, the government actually will take in the panel's report, read that, and then respond with recommendations as a draft. And that's supposed to happen early 2022 next year. And we assume that a final government response will be released, and then from that, relevant legislation, but of course that is all pending the outcome of the next election. So that's all of our formal sort of slides that we have for you tonight. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now it gets to the more interactive part of the evening of the Q&A. All right, we have Pete and Alice. I believe you have a question for Phil. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask that directly to Phil?
Are there any particular people who are trying to lessen the environmental laws as they even currently stand, or maybe voting against sort of some wildlife protections? And what can we do to sort of minimise that happening?
I'll answer that as best I can. Certainly the recreational hunting community doesn't want deer to be unprotected. They believe that they should be protected as a game species. It's a rather futile stand, because there are really the chance of wiping deer out completely, unless there's a sort of a specialised deer pandemic, is really unlikely. So there will always be deer to hunt. And traditionally, I should say that when the protection of deer was first taken on as being an important thing for hunters, there were very few deer in Victoria. And the idea of hunting deer, particularly sambar deer, which was the main one back then, was to use your skill as a hunter against the skill of the deer, to track the deer maybe for a week through the bush. That was the sport. That was why it was called a sport. And many of the old hunters, the people that are now running the Australian Deer Association or the Sporting Shooters Association, have actually lost the pleasure of that, because you can just drive down the road and pop one off, basically. So while there is some opposition to unprotecting them, it's not very strong. It's actually not a terribly strong opposition. We've been involved in these discussions for some time now. Apart from that, there are just the normal sort of anti-conservation lobby, I suppose, that turns out through various individuals and things in the community. But it's not an issue as in fighting a very strong opposition. I don't think at the moment. I think it could be framed very well just as a sensible act that would have reasonable support.
I don't know if this has come up, but I know it's been raised in New South Wales, and that is the issue of deregulating authorities to control wildlife. So I think there's been certain landowner lobby interests in New South Wales that have effectively wanted to have some deregulatory approach to handing out permitting to kill wildlife, basically. And this is picked up in one phrase, in some respects, elliptically in the issues paper, and that is about regulatory burden. So the notion that we need to alleviate regulatory burden on those who need to kill native wildlife, usually for productive or commercial purposes, especially in agriculture, is possibly an area where where there will be pushback in terms of not having greater environmental approach, but in fact going the other way.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks Phil, Bruce and Pete and Alice for your question. Sue, I believe you have a question for Bruce. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask that one?
Yeah, I will. I can't go back and find it because I'm sitting here in the dark, still no power. I've actually got a few. One of them is, Bruce, I know Proctor was being worked on recently. Do you know whether they've come out with the finished version and whether it includes wildlife?
Sorry, I didn't quite pick up the question. Can you say it again?
Yeah, Proctor, you know, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animal one, that act, that was being worked on, was it last year, the year before, I don't remember now. I'm just wondering whether that's
so as far
been
as
revised and come out yet.
Sorry, so yeah, as far as I know, it hasn't been concluded. I think it was 2019 they were reviewing that, and it's probably gone down in the pandemic black hole in terms of work yet to be completed. I think. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, that was one question, thanks.
Sue,
Another,
I actually...
The OCR is unbelievable. Can I just get this one quick?
Yeah, sorry, I actually had, I found your
totally...
question. Yeah, you go.
Oh, okay. The OCR is totally useless when it comes to timber harvesting, demolition of our public forests. Are they likely to be any better when it comes to wildlife? Or are they going to be just as useless?
Right, how do I diplomatically respond to that? I think in part the problem that the OCR is dealing with is the weakness of the Act itself. So arguably, if you had a stronger, more effective, more transparent law that was more easily enforceable and easier to administer, then perhaps the OCR has got an easier job to do. I think the OCR, if I can be as generous as possible, is probably hamstrung by the fact that it is not an independent statutory authority and has to operate basically within the confines of DELP. Beyond that, I think, look, what I would generally say is that it's probably easy for OCR to deal with low-hanging fruit, and also that is particularly egregious wildlife crimes. But to be as generous as I can to them, I think they are hampered by the kind of archaic and opaque nature of the law now too.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Okay,
Thanks,
we've got a few questions coming in here. So thanks, Sue, for your question. Mary, you have a question about DELP and wildfire and fuel reduction burns. Did you want to ask that, and maybe either Bruce or Phil could answer that?
Okay, thanks. Yes, I'm worried about planned burn damage to animals and habitat. I want to know if DELP are exempt from responsibility to protect animals under the existing Act. They don't do surveys before after burns, and obviously nocturnal animals are, just being taken out in hollow trees. Yes, so that's it. Thanks.
Do you want to have a crack at this first?
I'll have a quick go and then pass to you. Yep. I totally agree with your problem with the responsibility in relation to wildlife and fuel reduction burns. The problem that I have with DELP and fire, well, I have many problems, but in this regard is that DELP's biodiversity assessments of whether to do a burn and what happens afterwards, it's almost entirely now based on computer modelling. So there is there's really practically a complete absence from DELP of on-ground monitoring and on-ground surveys before they do a burn. And I think it's just fundamentally wrong, and it's evolved over time. The sophistication of their modelling is quite spectacular, but if you don't actually check your model on the ground, it doesn't matter how sophisticated it is. It isn't. It can't just be the computer says burn or the computer says don't burn, so you do it. I mean, and there are some very good examples of how wrong that has gone in recent times. But I might pass to Bruce in terms of where the legal responsibility lies there.
Well, like a lot of things under this Act, it's probably a vast grey area. And even if it was relatively clear, enforcement would be quite difficult. Probably what I would suggest at this stage is that there's a number of angles or avenues by which I think planned burning is problematic legally. One is there are offence provisions under the regulations that protect wildlife habitat. And I know people made some comments about wildlife habitat, which I didn't deal with in my comments, but it's a difficult, complex, but very important area of its own. Where the habitat regulations, the wildlife habitat regulations effectively prohibit destruction or take of wildlife habitat unless it's enabled under some other law. So arguably, if fire management's being done lawfully, then all things being equal, it's being enabled under another law. At the same time, especially where you're dealing with threatened species, it's probably far more problematic in terms of the way planned burns being conducted from a legal point of view, especially where things like the precautionary principle get attracted, which certainly would in the case of threatened species management. And if you, so I think probably the most problematic situations are where burning's being done with no assessments or monitoring whatsoever. And yeah, especially where threatened species are involved. I think that's probably the real pointy end of where there's potential for unlawfulness in the planned burning regime. But to be honest, I don't think anyone's really closely looked at it, but I suspect there's kind of it's probably broader concerns and problems with the planned burning regime as it functions in relation to wildlife law and management now as well. So I'm sorry that's a bit of a ambiguous answer, but problem is the law is pretty murky too.
Great, thanks Bruce, Phil and Mary for your question. So we're just going to have two more questions and then we're going to sign off for the night. So Emily, you have a question. I might actually get you to direct it to Matt and he can answer the next questions.
No worries. Hi, Matt. Or yeah, anyone who'd like to answer. I was just wondering, as far as, you know, these kinds of documents that are open for public comment, what length of response do you think is more likely to be well received by the people on the other side? Are we talking a short and sweet couple paragraphs or an essay? And I believe someone else also asked, which I was wondering, you know, individual comments more or less powerful than something that's from an organisation? Thank you.
So I think, do you want me to respond to that? So I think organisations are good. And remember, you can do it twice then as the organisation and then as the individual. I think the key thing is probably, and I suppose it's a question of time and your expertise. So if you've got time and expertise to write an essay, that to justify your points, that's useful as well. But it probably goes to sort of credibility. You're probably better to be concise and clear as much as it is to do with length. So some keyed up points that you feel comfortable with, where you can provide evidence, which can be personal experience or personal interest. They're the ones I think get most interest. It's really important to put it in your own language though. So these days they tend to not like the bulk sort of form response emails and tend to chuck them all into one bucket and count them as one. So the more individual it can be, the better, and where you've got evidence to support that, which could be your own story or you know, a reference or citing something else, I think that's good. So concise.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess I'm a PhD researcher, so I was wondering whether it's best to come from the more colloquial, you know, I'm a member of public standpoint, or the more professional angle.
If you've got the expertise, use it, I would have thought. So yes, if you've got a PhD and you can do some research to justify your points, I think that's valuable.
So, Millie, I'll just reiterate what Matt said. I think I saw a talk that you gave on, I can't remember the species that you're looking at, but it's in grassland, isn't it?
Yes, you got me. That's fat-tailed dunarts, yes.
Yeah, look, I'd actually reiterate what Matt said. If you've got expertise, then use it.
Yeah.
The panel, especially because you've got an independent expert panel, and they'll be interested in those kind of case studies and the kind of wider ramifications and exposition of those case studies, like how they demonstrate a bigger point. So I think I recall from your talk, something like the whole how that fits into ecosystem process is actually quite a significant point from my memory.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I guess I was just wondering, is my point of view as a public opinion and someone who cares a lot more likely to be received better than the more expert side, or how that might sort of roll with this kind of thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. And our last question, Wendy Cox, you have a question for Matt. Did you want to ask that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that if you want first, and then maybe I'll ask you, Bruce, because it's a sort of a tricky one in this piece of legislation. There is already something about habitat, I think, in either the regulations or in the legislation itself, but it's unclear how it sort of applies in the current way the Wildlife Act work. I would say habitat should be included. There are things, but the question would be sort of how does the mechanism then translate from the law to actually have an impact on the habitat? So there's things like this idea of having a public authority duty, so that the public authorities, who are generally the biggest clearers in the state, for example, have to take into account their implications for wildlife, would be one technique that the Act could include. You could talk about broader things, which I think Bruce mentioned, around things like ecosystem processes and ensuring that they're sufficient to ensure the survival of particular species. But having some practical tools, reinforcing threatened species rules around protection of habitat, not having clear-cut exemptions. For example, in the existing regulations, they exempt the forestry industry full stop. So there's a range of those things that would definitely help it. Bruce, do you have a further idea?
Yeah, I would say that the issue of wildlife habitat protection is in many ways like both the most complicated and the pointy edge of the whole management regime in some ways, or regulatory regime, because basically everything across the state could be almost put in the category of habitat for wildlife. I think what I would suggest, in addition to what Matt said, and I'd emphasise the point around duties on public authorities or effectively on the Crown to protect and conserve and recover wildlife, is a useful tool in this respect. A form of it is under the FFG Act now, but it really hasn't been tested. The other things that I would suggest is there are mechanisms under the FFG Act, like critical habitat protections, like critical habitat determinations, for instance, that attach to the listing of threatened species that are not, they don't have to be used under the FFG Act. So what I'm proposing in ours, that there's requirements where you've got listed wildlife that you have to prepare critical habitat protections. So at least for threatened species, there is then a mechanism for critical habitat to be identified and to be protected in some form for those species. There's a range of other tools that could potentially be useful in this space. For instance, legally recognising and requiring the protection of or identification of wildlife corridors or key wildlife corridors, or connectivity, especially for migratory species. That would be an interesting one. And there's also other tools under the FFG Act that could be quite useful, like flora and fauna management plans. Again, they're a discretionary device under the FFG Act, but if there's requirements to use those kind of plans to protect wildlife, that would be quite a useful tool as well, and would, you know, go beyond effectively where we are now. But it's not, again, it's not an easy part of the Act and of the whole regulatory scheme to negotiate, and I think we'll have to do some further thinking on that, and probably in discussions with the panel and hopefully with government down the track as well.
Great, thank you everyone for your questions. If there was burning questions that we didn't get a chance to answer tonight, definitely feel free to email us, vnpa@vnpa.org.au, and we'll do the best that we can to email those if you've got any burning ones. But really thanks to our speakers, our panel, Phil, Bruce and Matt, and to all of you for asking your questions and for your dedication to protecting Victoria's wildlife. We hope that you feel a little more empowered to write your own submissions and get those in by the 30th of June. Tomorrow we will be sending out a recording and our submission guidelines and key points to help you in your submission if you need it, but definitely use your own expertise, you know, if you feel that if we want to contribute that as well. So thank you once again for joining us. Go enjoy your dinner, and yeah, we look forward to powering on to get our submissions in for the review of the Wildlife Act. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.